Mission Log Supplemental, number 21, another one with David Gerrold.
Welcome into a supplemental edition of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm Ken Ray.
And I'm John Champion.
Most of the time on Mission Log, what we do is we take apart an episode of Star Trek or a Star Trek story, but sometimes we get to sit down with people who tell us stories about Star Trek. This week, we are happy to welcome back David Gerrold. Now, last time we talked to him primarily about the original series, and this time we'll pick up with a bit more detail about the time that he spent on The Next Generation, which oddly enough is where we're spending a lot of time these days.
Ken, one might say we're actually supplementing our discussion of Next Gen.
Well,
Discussion with David.
If one felt clever, John, they might say that, yes.
Yeah, I don't have that in me right now. But
Yeah,
I will tell you this. A little later in the show, we will be joined by Larry Nemeczek to discuss a new discovered document from the Roddenberry archive. So please stick around for that. It's a jam-packed show just with those two things. So we're not actually going to do listener callback, feedback this time, but that will be coming. I can promise you that, because boy, do we get email.
All right, so we got the Larry Nemeczek thing. We got the David Gerrold thing. Before we get to either of those things, though, we would like to introduce a sponsor for this week's show.
Ken, I have a question for you. If you could fly, okay, so if you just woke up tomorrow morning and you're like, hey, look, I can fly.
Yep.
What would you wear?
What would I wear?
Yeah.
That is a really interesting question.
Yeah.
So you know the clone trooper, like from the Clone Wars, I guess, the second Star Wars movie or whatever that was it Attack of the Clones? From Attack of the Clones.
Totally.
I've actually got one of those helmets.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And it's got one of the fins, kind of like the Rocketeer had.
Yeah.
I might be tempted. I think I might have to wear that.
That's good. Yeah.
And some clothing.
I would hope so. I'd hope that there would be pants involved of some sort.
Yeah,
I
no,
wouldn't
not
just the helmet.
Yeah, I got to protect the head. Everything else is free and easy. No, otherwise it'd probably be whatever the thickest canvas stuff I could find, or maybe my leather jacket, because you want to knock off any abrasions that might come your way.
Right. It'd be like a Rocketeer look, but with a clone trooper's helmet.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, the reason I asked, our sponsor for the week is, it is a very cool concept, a graphic novel called Bizarre New World. And you can visit that at bizarrenewworld.com. And I really, really want people to visit that, because the creator of this comic book series and anthology, Skipper Martin, he is a Star Trek fan, and he is reaching out specifically to Star Trek fans, and specifically through Mission Log, because this is a story that I'm sure will be interesting to many, many people in our audience. The premise is exactly what I posed to you, Ken. Not what would you wear, but
it's about how the world would be different if I could fly.
Well, not you.
No. Man.
Yeah, I know. But what if one day one person woke up and could fly? Like, everything's normal. It's not aliens invading. It's not superheroes. It's nothing like that. Everything else is normal. But this one guy, Paul Crutcher, wakes up and he can fly. Mm-hmm. So he's special for a moment. But then what if everybody else could fly too? Then suddenly the entire world changes. The way you go to work, the way that you interact with each other, the way you stop for coffee, all of these things change. And it's pretty amazing. And what I like about this series is that he's taking a very humanistic view toward what happens. So you take humanity and you throw in a bizarre science fiction twist, and then you've got something that's both smart and funny and has something to say, not unlike Star Trek. So I like the combination of us talking about Bizarre New World.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, there is a cool thing that you and I talked about beforehand. Mm-hmm. He's not looking for people to fund him so that he can finish this thing.
No, he's not a starving
artist. This thing is done.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with starving artists. And that's certainly, because what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to go to Kickstarter and sort of support part of this. But understand, there is a finished product out there. This story has a beginning, it has a middle, and thankfully it has an end.
Unlike our show.
Well, unlike a lot of things. Like, I went to that Golden Compass movie a few years back, the one with Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig, I think it was, right? Mm-hmm. And I saw it, and for whatever reason, I enjoyed it at the time. And I just realized this year I don't think they're ever going to make the sequels. Now, I know there are books, but the point is, this is not something that you're going to get into and then there's no ending. Let's say, I don't know, no, I don't want to do that. It hurts too many people. Suffice to say, I mean, this ends.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying so good because it'll be done. I'm saying so good, you're not going to be left hanging. He's not looking for somebody to come along and, give him an extra $10 to write an extra 3 pages. The pages are done except for the physical page part.
Right. So that's where you come in. If you go to bizarrenewworld.com, you can read a preview, you can get more information about it, and you can go to his Kickstarter campaign. And here's what's awesome. You have your choice of how to get the book. You can do a digital download, although, and I agree, Skip Martin insists that the way to see this is in the real, true printed format. So then what happens is you can get the whole book, and you can also get the anthology for Bizarre New World, where he's got contributors from all over the place doing these additional stories that take place in that world. So the hard work is already done. He spent more than 10 years developing this story, and the story is ready to be released to the world. So you can get it, and you can find out more at bizarrenewworld.com.
And can we spell that for people? Because Lord knows I had a hard time with it.
Sure. bizarrenewworld.com. bizarrenewworld.com.
And it really is. I've had the good fortune of reading. I'm a little bit more than halfway through. And I'm bummed that I didn't get to finish it before we came here. Although the good news is I won't accidentally spoil it for you.
No,
but I will tell you, now that we've done the ad and now that my whatever obligation, I guess, to paying attention to it is over, I will still be going and finishing it because I'm quite fascinated to see where it's going and find out what's going to happen.
And you and I both noticed there's a Star Trek reference in the book.
Yeah, there is. It's actually kind of funny. I thought it was kind of funny anyway. And it's it's a comic book. It's geeky. And I'm not saying all comic books are geeky, but it's geeky in like a weird. So you asked the question of what would I wear, and that's that's like kind of the dumb question that you and I would ask each other. There are several pages of how would a guy fly anyway? Well, let this bunch of engineers get together and answer that for you. It really is. It's an impressive thing that he's done. And now, what we're looking for people to do is make it possible for a lot of other people to find out just how impressive it is. So bizarrenewworld.com and pledge what you can and help somebody else realize their dream.
So if I can kick things off, what I really want to do is have you sort of fill the gap a little bit. We know that you worked on the animated series. We discussed BEM at length in our show. And then that time between the end of the animated series and then going into Next Gen. I know that you worked on Land of the Lost, Logan's Run.
I was in the animated series. Lou Scheimer took a shine to me, liked me a lot. I liked Lou. We lost him last year, I think.
Yeah.
And Lou was a funny guy. He'd spin off titles and tell his artists, go give me a poster. Snow White and the Seven Ghosts. Snow White is a cat, and the Seven Ghosts are his previous 7 lives that he's lost. And so he's only got 2 lives left. And give me a poster on that, and then he would spin off like 6 of these, and then the NBC vice president would come in and Lou would bring in the posters and line them up and says, and these are the shows we have in development. Well, they weren't. They were just posters with titles. And the NBC vice president would say, oh, yeah, I like that one. I know, no, yes, all right. And that was how they sold Saturday morning shows. And Lou had it down. And he had, so after Star Trek Animated, he had Tarzan.
Yeah.
And I wrote 2 scripts for it, pilot scripts. And then he sent me off to talk to Edgar Rice Burroughs Jr., which I thought would be a great honor. And the guy was, and it was like already 30, I think. So I knew what I was doing. I'd written and published a bunch of novels, had some Hugo and Nebula nominations. And I like to think that I was, approaching what would eventually be, my prime. I like to think I was really I understood. Mm-hmm. And I had gone back, I'd read the Tarzan books and really did, it's like, gee, let's be more honest to Tarzan than anyone else has ever been. Let's stay true to the source material. And I go in, and Herb Jr. balls me out for daring to rewrite the greatest writer in the history of the entire English language. I said, I'm not rewriting Shakespeare, and or Dickens, or Mark Twain, or Harlan Ellison. Anyway, but he balls me out. And or Theodore Sturgeon, or Heinlein, and but he balls me out, and I go back to Lou Scheimer and say, I don't want to work on Tarzan. He said, you'll never have to deal with that man again. I said, he's killed my enthusiasm. And then Joe Terratero, the NBC vice president, comes in one day. He says, I want you to go over and meet with Sid and Marty. They've got this thing that they're having some trouble with. So Sid had this book of pictures that he had cut out from various magazines and magazine covers, which hurt to look at. He's like, oh my God, he's cutting up magazines. And tells me this very vague story about there's this place, but he didn't have a story. And they said, can you make this work? And of course I was very arrogant and hubris and like, okay, yeah, I can make it work. And I did the trick I learned from Star Trek. I learned the first season of Star Trek, Gene had hired only or mostly science fiction writers. And going to the animated show, Dorothy had done the same thing when she was producing. I said, yeah, I can make this work. So I was story editor, and I brought in Ben Bova, Norman Spinrad, Weena Sturgeon, Ted's wife. Walter Koenig wanted to prove he could write, and he did a great job. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I brought in science fiction writers who knew their way around the script. They did a great job. They made me look good, and people still talk about Land of the Lost. Not for its great special effects, but for the storytelling. Yeah. So it was a great lesson to learn. Somewhere in there was this movie that came out with Wookiees and stuff, and everybody went crazy, and I thought, oh my God, this is going to change science fiction, and in ways not necessarily for the best. And sure enough, we got a lot of imitation Star Wars. Now, but in 1977... Universal wanted to do Buck Rogers, and I worked on that for a while, and then it hit a dead end, and they brought it back with a different group of people. But they had also been doing Star Trek Phase 2, and now Mark Cushman knows this whole story better than I do, that NBC realized they had made a mistake with Star Trek almost immediately, and they wanted to bring it back. But Paramount said no, because they were making so much money off the syndicated episodes. They were terrified that a new Star Trek would compete with the syndicated show. It's like, no, but... And they went back and forth. NBC kept saying, we want to bring Star Trek back, and Paramount kept saying no. And when Paramount finally said, we want to bring Star Trek back, nobody could get everybody to the table at the right time, but finally Paramount says, all right, we're going to do Phase 2 with Gene. Mm-hmm. And Gene and I was going to do a script for him, and then I went over and worked on Buck Rogers. Then, of course, Star Wars came out, and Paramount said, gee, we want a Star Wars, too. Everybody wanted a Star Wars. Suddenly, every studio wanted their own blockbuster summer sci-fi picture. And Paramount execs look around and say, gee, we'd like to have our own Star Wars. So they said, well, let's turn Star Trek into a feature. This was, in one respect, a mistake, because Star Trek works best as a TV series. As a feature, you have to have a big budget, so you have to have lots of special effects, and it turns into, gee, we have to have a villain to fight, which is what almost all the movies have been about, but not when Gene was there. Gene was ambitious. He says, Gene was always challenging the idea of let's go out and meet God, which is not an easy story to tell, but Gene was ambitious, and I always thought, as difficult a story as that is, I got to give him credit for trying it. Because Star Trek's the only place where you can tell that story, really. The problem with that motion picture is it got out of control. There were multiple drafts of the script. The first guy doing special effects wasted, I forget how much, 3 million, 5 million, how much, we don't know how much. He built these beautiful models and then blew them up in his test reels. They had to replace him with Doug Trumbull.
Right.
So right then, you're in the hole for a few million. And then they brought along Robert Wise, who is a brilliant director. I cannot say enough wonderful things about Robert Wise. I mean, you look at the man's career, The Sand Pebbles, Sound of Music, West Side Story, The Day the Earth Stood Still. He knew how to bring a picture in and make it work. And who wouldn't want to work with Robert Wise? So it was a dream project, but it ballooned out of control. And the studio blamed Gene. It wasn't all Gene, but part of the problem was they were getting script pages delivered to the set after they'd already shot the scene from the pages they already had. So the script was always being rewritten during the entire process, so nobody knew what costumes or props or sets or whatever they were going to need until the last minute. There were delays, and the film shipped wet. Now what that means is you take it out of the developer, you put it in the can, you don't even dry it off. It's going to dry off on its first trip through the projector. There were problems with it. One of the problems was Paramount said, we paid all this money for special effects. We want to see the special effects. So the director's cut, Robert Wise's cut, which had some very key characterization scenes, was only seen on airplanes. There are pieces missing from the theatrical version that would have made it a better picture.
Right.
And because and then this is my personal complaint, is that the picture had this score by Jerry Goldsmith, which was brilliant opening score, brilliant opening bit with the Klingon stuff, but then it was a very slow-paced score, almost turgid. And so here you have all these dark special effects, they're not bright enough, and this turgid score, and the picture seems to lumber along slowly. And it's very frustrating because Star Trek was always bright-colored and fast-paced. So what we got was not bright-colored and fast-paced.
Well, so let me ask you this. You were around for that transition of Phase 2. You're aware of the production of Phase 2.
Yeah, because I stayed in touch with Gene a lot.
Yeah, and then you were there for the motion picture. And I think everybody listening knows that you're in that shot. If we want to look for you in the rec room.
And
a lot of the
next to Robert Wise's wife.
Oh, nice. And it's kind of the family reunion. John and Bijo are there, and you're there. And
Susan Sackett's there.
Dorothy is there.
LA area fans and people,
But then at the end of the motion picture, so it didn't do as well as people expected, and then you have
this.
Well, it made a lot of money, but critically, it was not.
No, it was a critical disaster. But Star Trek fans went back and saw it a dozen times.
Right.
Who wouldn't?
It was beautiful to look at, certainly on the screen.
It's a beautiful picture, and it's underrated, and it's not my favorite movie.
Yeah, right.
But for me, the fun was getting to spend time with Kirk and Spock and McCoy. All the other characters, But, the key for me with Trek is always Kirk, Spock, and McCoy.
Well, so then you have a change. You have a regime change, and Harv Bennett comes in to do 2.
All right, so
and then you've got this gap up through.
What happens is the studio knows they can do Star Trek movies and make money, but they don't want Gene involved because Gene got to take the blame for the picture, everything that went wrong. So Gene gets kicked upstairs to emeritus. They let him keep his office, but he's got... Now, one of the smart things Gene did, Gene had a cutthroat lawyer, a man I despise and cannot say enough bad things about, but representing Gene, he did a lot of great things to protect Gene's interests in the show. And so every time there was a movie, there was a renegotiation with Gene where Gene got whittled away Paramount's position a little bit more and Gene got a little bit better position, which if I had been in the same place, I'd have done the exact same thing. I would have wanted a lawyer every bit as evil. So the studio goes to Harv Bennett and they say, we want to try bringing back Star Trek. We know there's money here. And we're going to do it as a TV movie. And Harv Bennett says to them, let me shoot it in such a way that we could release it to the theaters. And if the film is good enough, I want you to release it to the theaters. And the studio agrees because there's more money to be made. So Harv Bennett shoots The Wrath of Khan. Now, he sends me an early draft of the script. He sent it to Ted Sturgeon as well, and I forget who else. And I sent him a memo, 90% of which was wrong, but there is a scene in it in midway through the script where Spock dies, and it's really just the training mission. And I said to him, this is a great scene, move it to the beginning. Because, first of all, there's already the rumor that Spock dies, this will defuse it, the audience. Oh, this is what it was. But also, it plays this wonderful little joke on the audience. You start off with this incredible action scene, and everybody dies. The audience is going, oh my God, what's going on? Then you open it up, Kirk walks in, Turk walks up to Spock. I thought you are dead, whatever. Yeah. And you realize it's this whole training mission, and it's great because it kicks you into high gear. And Harv Bennett said, next draft of the script I saw, that was what they had done. And I get a call from Harv. We just got the first cut, the answer print, right out of the developer. Nick Myers and I are going to screen it tonight. Do you want to see it? He's like, man, I'm down to this. Like, that was that streak between the Valley and Hollywood. Like, and I go into the screening room, and I'm in, like, the fourth row or whatever, and Harv and Nick come in and sit in the back. And I said, all right, I should go say hello, but, the movie starts. And for about 2 minutes, I think, this is great. And then I said, am I allowed to laugh? That was funny. And I said, how the hell with it? I'm just going to have a good time. I'm watching Star Trek.
Nice.
And I just laughed at all the, and gasped at all and just reacted full out in an empty theater. And I get a call from Harv the next day. He says, oh, God, thank you. For what? He says, for enjoying yourself. We didn't know if the jokes were going to work. We didn't know if the movie was going to work. Thank you. Now we know it works. And then he calls me again 2 weeks later after the picture opens and says, every place you laughed, the audience laughed. Every place you reacted, the audience reacted. You're my official pre-screener, so I'll know if the jokes work. And so Harv and I just really hit it off, and I really respected that he understood what a Star Trek movie needed to be. And I cannot say enough nice things about Nick Meyer, who is just a marvelous writer. And he's a great director. He understood partway in. He says, he wrote this in one of his interviews or one of his books. He said, I didn't know what I was doing, and one day I said, wait a minute, I don't have to be careful. I can take chances here, because this might be the only time I ever get to direct. And so he did a lot of really nice things with Wrath of Khan. I enjoyed the picture enormously, and I think if you ask the fans, they would rate it as the second best Star Trek movie of all time, the first best being Galaxy Quest.
Of course. Well, so there's this time then where the movie franchise is in Harv's hands, and then we get to 1986.
And Gene is off in exile.
Yeah, Gene's off doing something else. And then these rumors start to hold water that there will be a new TV series. And I'm curious when you started hearing about this and when this became a reality.
You have to understand, there's like 5 movies before we get to 1986, and Gene is very bitter about the fact that he doesn't get to be part of the production. He gets to be the producer emeritus. He gets to read the scripts. Gene was also he was leaking the scripts. If he didn't like the script, he'd leak it and then let the fans complain.
Well, you mentioned the Spock death, and that was revealed that pretty much came from his office.
Harv Bennett did that thing they call a canary trap, where each script was marked, and so when the script leaked to the fans, this was Gene leaked his script.
Yeah.
So I mean, Gene was. I want to be polite about this. Gene had his flaws as a human being. We all do. I fart in elevators and pick my nose and wipe the boogers on the vinyl couch. But Gene's flaws, if you're a great man, you're entitled to great flaws. Gene gave us Star Trek. This mitigates almost everything else, because Star Trek changed who we are as a people. It is a vision of us being a better species. And there is nothing else in the history of movies or television that has had that impact. And that earns Gene his place in heaven. His failures as a human being, I think, it goes to something Bill Murray once said, is that when you get famous, you get 2 years of being a jerk. And you either recognize you're a jerk and you stop, or it gets stamped in indelibly. And I think this whole thing of fame is one of the most pernicious destroyers of human relationships, because it gets in the way of being able to relate to people as people. And Gene being the great bird, it was fun when he was producing the show, but then when the fan phenomenon started, it kind of insulated him from the responsibility of being a competent producer. You start to get used to being idolized, and it gets in the way. There's that bubble. You're on this pedestal whether you want to be there or not. And I don't know anybody who has really done a good job of getting off that pedestal.
Well, and this is the Gene making a show in 1986 versus a Gene making a show in 1966.
Now the other thing is Gene's health. was in decline. Majel would put him on the train and send him down to Lacoste every weekend to dry off. He would come back. It's my firm conviction that the lawyer, Leonard Maeslish, was providing him with the kinds of substances that the human body should not have to deal with on a regular basis. And it was hurting Gene physically. I mean, Gene was a big man. He was a strong man. He had a great physique. He should have had another 20 years on the planet. But substance abuse destroys your body. And so we got to 1986. He was still in mostly good shape when the studio announced that they were going to do a new Star Trek. But the new Star Trek didn't just happen because somebody at Paramount said, let's do a new Star Trek. There was Rick Berman wanted to do Star Trek Academy. And then Gene found out that there were negotiations with Fox to do a new Star Trek. And Gene said, you're not doing it without me. And there were negotiations back and forth. Here's the 20th anniversary party. And everybody expects there to be some spectacular announcement. And there wasn't. There was just this party. And I was at that party, chatted with Robin Williams was there. I miss Robin. He's such a hero of mine. And everybody was there. We had a great time. It was a very expensive party. I mean, it looked like they must have spent at least $100,000 on it. And wait a minute, what didn't get announced? Well, that party was set up. They were going to announce the return of Star Trek, but it didn't happen because there was still stuff going on behind the scenes. And I heard this story. The studio had not been paying Gene his fair share of the ownership of Star Trek, and Gene had managed to find out. It's quite an interesting story. I managed to find out that it was like about $30 million the studio owed Gene that he had not gotten. So, and this is one of the places where I actually have to respect what Leonard Maeslish, the lawyer, did. So they negotiate a new Star Trek series, and when they fill in the contract, all they put in is... now, Gene couldn't get an audit on the original series. So the new contract, he has the right to audit. And the lawyer fills in on the name of the show. It's Untitled Star Trek Show. Star Trek. And they sign the contract. And shortly after the announcement, Gene apparently and the lawyer and a couple other people walk up to one side with the president of the studio and say, we will be auditing the records on Monday. What do you mean, you don't have an audit? Yes, we do. The contract says we get to audit Star Trek. All right, so the lawyer knew it. So there was, the studio was not happy, but the studio came back to Gene and said, all right, if we give it to you all in one lump sum, it's going to disappear in taxes. So here's how we're going to pay it out to you. And they gave him $1 million signing bonus and like $100,000 a week or whatever, so that it would be amortized across, and which is a pretty good deal when you think about it. Although there are ways to handle it any other way too. But so now you have all this bad blood in place, 30 years of bad blood. 20 years of bad blood. And Gene has got a certain degree of bitterness. He said to me one day, we're going to make a lot of enemies on this show, which was a very accurate prediction. What happened is they announced the show. I sent Gene a congratulatory letter. Congratulations. That's it. October 10th, they announced it. I was hoping, maybe I'll get a script assignment. That'll be nice. Instead, I get invited to come down to the studio. And what Gene and Bob and Eddie Milkus are doing, Bob Justman, Eddie Milkus and Gene, are screening science fiction films to bring Gene back up to... Everybody has to get back up to speed. So we screen Aliens. And we screen... I said, let's look at Ice Pirates for the production value. Dreadful movie. Gene said this is why they brought back the death penalty. But the production values were interesting. Because here was a low-budget movie that had some very strong values. And I forget what else we screened. But for 2 weeks, we would screen a movie, then we would go have lunch in the executive dining room. We'd walk in, the whole room would go quiet. They'd watch us walk in. There goes $20 million on the hoof. Because they knew we had a deal. We're going straight to syndication so that we will not have to deal with NBC vice president saying, oh, you can't do this on our show. We have broadcast standards. So we're all excited. We're going to get to do... And Rick Berman, bless his little heart, and I mean that in the southern sense, oh, bless your little heart, writes this wonderful memo 3-page memo listing 10, 15 ideas on each page. He must have listed 50 or 60 ideas. Here are stories you can do. Issues that we should address on the new Star Trek. And number 3 on the list was AIDS. This was in 1986. Rock Hudson hadn't come out yet. Yeah. And I was always interested in blood donorship. Kind of my way of honoring Robert A. Heinlein. So I wanted to do a script that would address the fact that blood donorship had fallen to critical levels because of the fear of AIDS. And I thought, let's do a script where the crew of the Enterprise, this comes later, I'm getting ahead of myself, the crew of the Enterprise has to donate blood because they run out of artificial blood. They have to donate blood, and then at the end, there's a card even that says, the Red Cross needs blood donations. I wanted to do something that would demonstrate, like if in the week after the episode aired, the Red Cross was swamped with people showing up to donate blood, it would prove the power of Star Trek to make a difference. But anyway, getting back to, so we have lunch every day for day. We haven't even got offices yet. We finally get offices in Building L, and they're only temporary because Gene has said to the studio he wants his old offices back, the original Trek offices, and we all wanted that. So Gene's back in his original office eventually. Gene says to me early in the process, he says, David, I want you to write the Bible, the Writer-Director's Guide. I said, great. Now, I have to tell you, what happened, but even before we get there, Bob Justman and I are churning out memos. Lots and lots and lots of memos. It was almost a contest to see who can write them. It's like, let's do this. Let's fix this. How about this? Bob Justman suggested a holodeck. I saw story problems, but I also said, we could do that. I said, but let's use it for training, because otherwise we end up trapped in doing interior stories where if we're going to do those interior recreational stories, somebody has to learn something. And it would be, we're in transit. It's because it's going to take a week to get where we're going, something. But, and I warned about the holodeck. And then, let's have families. Oh, God, please, let's not have families, but it's all right. And there's no story possibilities because, again, that makes us stay on the ship instead of getting out there, doing...
Well, let's talk about that just a little bit as kind of a sideline, because I've seen memos, some from you and some from Gene's office, talking about the idea of families on board. And this was introduced early in the show. It kind of went away as the show carried on. But what was the debate about that? And
well, it was, we're going to put 4,000 people on the ship. They're not going to be leaving their families behind. Well, why not? We send the aircraft carrier Nimitz out with 3,000, 4,000, 6,000 people on board, and they leave their families behind. Well, it's a 5-year mission. Or, well, in this case, 7-year mission. Okay, they take their families with them. But kids, it's like, and, I thought, all right, if that's where you guys insist on going, it's your show, Gene. If that's where you're going to, it was always whatever Gene wanted. Mm-hmm. And he says, and we're going to have a 15-year-old super genius, which is there is still a dent in the wall where I was banging my head because and I said, no, because you're going to turn it into Lost in Space, where the 15-year-old super genius solves everything. And Gene said it in the original Trek, if I'm not going to believe it on the bridge of the battleship Missouri, I'm not going to believe it on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. And I wrote a memo, it's in there, it said that kid who was in Stand By Me, I had forgotten his name at the time, and he was on Last Night's Saint Elsewhere, he would be perfect for Wesley Crusher, and here's the stories we should be telling, that he does not yet have the emotional experience for command, and our stories would be about training. Well, if we had gone in that route, Wesley Crusher would have been the idea was we have to appeal to all ages. No, we don't. I was like, Doctor Who appeals to all ages, and there's no 15-year-old super genius, and most of the 15-year-olds watching Doctor Who are not super geniuses anyway. They're just ordinary kids who like Doctor Who or whatever other show they're watching. And I think instead of this super genius thing, why not we show that ordinary people have heroism in them? Because that's real heroics, is when you are challenged to grow beyond what you thought you were capable of. So, but see, that wasn't the Star Trek that Gene wanted to do at the time, or it wasn't what he envisioned, or maybe that was what Leonard Maislish did, because what we learned very early... Now, Gene said, I want you to write the Bible. Mm-hmm. So I'm going in there, and I would say to Gene, what do you want to do? I was totally at service. And whatever he wanted, and he'd say, "Will you tell me what you think?" And this went on for 2 or 3 weeks. I'd go in, and we'd talk one character out. And I'd say, "Well, I think we should have an older captain who stays on board the ship as the wise old man, and our action hero is the first officer who leads the away team. That way we never put the captain in danger," which is, and he goes, "You're right." He said, "Write that." So I created, I did not create the names, but I created the descriptions for Picard, and every character I created, I named Raleigh or Magellan or somebody, and then Gene took them and gave them names. And then I would go off and do research to make sure we weren't duplicating anybody's name. So there was a Picard who was an explorer, which was a French explorer. But somewhere in there, Gene said, "We should probably have a therapist counselor." And yeah, that probably makes sense. And then the whole Betazoid thing started, and Gene, at one point, I think this was he only wrote 2 or 3 memos. One of his memos or one of his suggestions was that the Betazoid had 6 breasts. And by then, Dorothy Fontana had completed her obligation elsewhere. She'd come aboard and said, "Are these going to be horizontal or vertical? Are they going to be 2 rows?" And do you realize how these things have to be harnessed, and it's going to be a costuming problem. And the idea got dropped very quickly, and that shows you Dorothy has this very dry, methodical way of analyzing things that make you realize, God, that was a stupid idea. And so, Gene was going through, had a lot of stuff coming out of Gene's office. Let me say it differently. Let me approach it differently. We'd sit and have a meeting, and he would do this incredible rant, this incredible speech about, one time it was how religion, organized religion, was dangerous because it took people into delusional beliefs, and from out of which atrocities were committed. And so you would say, how do we turn that into a story? And he, and he would do all of these incredible visionary speeches. Then you would walk out of the room inspired. I want to do that story. But at the same time, we began to become aware that he was a little bit detached. I came into the office and went, "Did you see L.A. Law last night?" He says, "I don't watch TV." I said, so he had no idea what an ensemble was. So we talk ensemble. He had no idea. To him, ensemble was a couple of heroes and the 7 dwarves. No, if you look at L.A. Law and Hill Street Blues, those were ensemble shows where everybody was a hero. And I came in, did you see what they did on L.A. Law last night, where Arnie is in a bad mood and his secretary Roxanne says, "Come to my house, I have all the videotapes of Star Trek." And he says, "Do you have the one with the Tribbles?" Now, that caught me by surprise. I'm watching the episode, I fall out of my chair, and my phone starts ringing immediately. And I go in the next day and tell him, "Gene, look at what Star Trek has become." And he didn't hear it. It was like, oh, okay. I mean, it was just not, he didn't recognize. And we began to be, and we had a meeting with a writer one day, younger than me, but he had a beard. And Gene points at him and says, "You could learn a lot from him." And as if I'm still a 20-year-old kid, and I suddenly realized, oh crap, Gene still sees me and Dorothy as those 20-year-old kids from 20 years ago. He doesn't realize that we have not only gotten 20 years older too, but that we have each piled up significant credits that qualify us both to be producers. And I realized we are in trouble. That was one of my first realizations. We're in trouble. And Eddie Milkus left the show, which I never knew all the details on that, but he was first off. He recognized something wasn't going to work. And I think it was because of all of the ins and outs with Leonard Maislish, the lawyer. But Gene's health started going downhill. And then we noticed that Leonard Maislish was walking around telling us what we could and couldn't write. "Oh, you can't do that. It's aesthetically displeasing." Yes, it is. It's supposed to. This is a horror story. We want to shock the audience. Oh, and these two people can't have an argument. Everybody loves each other. If we can't have an argument, we can't do Kirk, Spock, and McCoy kind of that fun. We can't. And one of the things, everybody who came aboard said, let's have a Klingon on the bridge. I suggested it, Gene said no. Bob Justman suggested it, Gene said no. And everybody who came aboard after that, was we started getting new producers and every writer who came in, and, why don't we put a Klingon on the bridge? And Gene, and we don't suggest a Klingon on the bridge. Gene has already vetoed it. Okay. So Dorothy comes in to write the pilot script. And that was another cluster something. Because they kept giving her back and forth signals. 2-hour script, 90-minute script. Okay, 2 hour. No, 90-minute script. And then so she to structure. So she writes this 90-minute script, and then Gene takes it away and comes back with adding 30 minutes, which is Q. Gene adds Q to the entire thing and takes half the credit and half all the residual money, which did not sit well with Dorothy.
Of course.
And his justification was the studio wants his name on the pilot script, which was not true. We knew it wasn't true. But what Dorothy had written is the ship could split into 2 parts. That was, so when the ship splits, she puts a woman in command of the family section where everybody else goes off in the battle section. And it comes back with suddenly there's this new character, Worf, a Klingon, who stays in charge of, if I remember correctly, the family section. And even if he's your consigliere, he should be on the other ship, not the, but no, and that didn't sit well with anybody. It's like, wait a minute, we all said Klingon, and he said no, and all of a sudden, instead of leaving a woman in command, we get this Klingon in command, that after Gene has said no Klingon, and we're wondering, where the hell is this coming from, is that we cannot depend on what is said one thing is being true the next day. And it's like, I worked for, I would say, 2 months, maybe longer on the Bible, 3 months on the Bible, and just polishing it and making, and almost immediately I can see things are being ignored.
Well, this gets to something that I think has been always my question about Next Generation, and particularly that first year and a half, 2 years that you're talking about.
2 years.
That so many times when we hear sort of, fans and all the armchair quarterbacking that goes on with Star Trek, and people say, what Star Trek really needs is a Gene Roddenberry. It needs Gene's vision. And I look at the first year and a half of Next Generation, which is very inconsistent. There are great moments and there are some bad moments. And I say, well, this was the dream team. This was Gene Roddenberry, Bob Justman, David Gerrold, D.C. Fontana. But something didn't mesh. Something didn't happen.
What didn't mesh is we had 3 other producers who were put in above Dorothy and me. Dorothy and I both expected to be the showrunners. Mm-hmm. We would have been great co-showrunners. Mm-hmm. We get along. We practically read each other's minds. We bounce ideas off each other. I have a wild streak. She has the methodical streak. So we balance each other very well. And all of a sudden, here comes Morris Hurley and Bob Lewin and Herb Wright. And Bob Lewin is a great guy. Herb Wright was a really interesting guy. I didn't know Morris Hurley that very well. And none of them had ever worked on Trek. We had to teach them. And they didn't want to listen. It was like, we don't, and all of a sudden Rick Berman is aboard. And Gene did not like Rick Berman at all. He understood Rick Berman is there to watchdog over Gene and make sure the budget doesn't balloon out of control again. And so there was a lot of jockeying for position. And everybody who came in, and Morris Hurley has an interesting interview on Bill Shatner's documentary Chaos on the Bridge, which is also about the first 2 years. And Morris Hurley came right out and said nobody knew what was going on, and Gene was a wackadoodle, and I took charge of everything and threw out all that other stuff. And and a lot of what you got was Morris Hurley. And I had brought in a bunch of writers very early on. They had pitched scripts, they'd gotten assignments. I thought early on, I said, look, we have in October, we are starting in October, other shows start in May.
Right. We
could have 26 scripts ready to go on the start date. So I was bringing in writers and taking pitches. And when Morris Hurley came along, they all got canceled. Except one, the Diane Duane script, Where None Have Gone Before. And Morris Hurley did a complete rewrite on it, and it turned into Alice in Wonderland. And all of the rest got cut off. So, and what happens, we get to our June 1st start date, and we don't have a single script ready to shoot. And all that time between October 10th, I started on October 20th, all that time from October to June got pissed away because there was no consistency or coherency of planning. And a large part of it, I put the blame on the fact that Leonard Maizlish was taking advantage of Gene's failing health, and that we had, like, at that point, 4 different producers. And by the time we got to June, I was no longer even being told, we're having a meeting, come sit in on the... And I wrote a memo one time, you might have it, is like, seeing as how nobody's reading my memos, maybe I should stop writing them. And 2 days later, Leonard Maizlish showed, oh, we like your memos, David. I said, yeah, you might read them, but you don't listen to what I have to say. And Gene said to me when we started, he says, you're probably going to be one of the most important people on the show because you understand Star Trek better than anybody. He actually said, you may even understand it better than me. And I said, that's very pleasing to hear, Gene, but you're still, always going to be the great bird. You have the vision. But what happened was the people who knew the show, me and Dorothy and Bob, got pushed aside. And I didn't realize it until I heard later on, Rick Berman, to some degree, hated the original Star Trek and wanted all of the original people gone so he could do the show he wanted to do. That is the way it was explained to me by people who actually had a close... So it's like Dorothy and I never had a chance to do the Star Trek that Gene had promised us we were going to get to do, is that there were people playing office politics. Now, you can take this as David Gerrold is a disgruntled ex-employee, and maybe there's a certain amount of truth to it, but I over here, after 30 people left in the first season and another 30 in the second season, I stopped taking it personally. It wasn't me. And I will say this, I'll go on record, leaving Star Trek was one of the better things I ever did in my life. Not because, and I miss Star Trek, I would have loved to work, but I had to reinvent what am I up to as a writer, as a storyteller, as a producer, whatever. And so I said, I'm going to concentrate on writing the novels that I have promised myself I'm going to write, and I'm going to adopt the little boy because I've been putting that off, and I'm going to build my own family and have my own life and not have it be defined by Star Trek. And so for me, I consider leaving Star Trek to be one of the better choices in my life. Although at the time it did not feel like it, I felt really unhappy. But throughout the 90s, as I got in touch with, I'm a dad, and I'm writing the novels I want to write, and I don't have to answer to anybody. I'm discovering my own vision of what's possible in storytelling. That's great. The other thing is that Gene Roddenberry, Rick Berman, Leonard Maizlish apparently issued a fatwa against me. I could not get work on any TV series. I couldn't even get an agent for 10 years. And so it's like, great, now I have to work on my novels and short stories and essays and columns and whatever. But nobody would ever cop to it. I never got anybody to cop to it directly, but there were Susan Sackett in her book came out and said so. And then when I wrote a congratulations to Jerry Taylor on Voyager, she wrote me back a note saying, "Oh, you're not welcome here." And I wrote back to her, said, "I don't want to write on Star Trek. I'm just saying, congratulations, you have custody of the franchise. Go do good." And so it was very clear to me that I had been. There's no official blacklist, but I'd been blacklisted for a while, and because what happened was when I left Trek. My agent calls me and says, what is this story that you were fired from Star Trek? I said, I wasn't fired. I left because I had this opportunity over at Columbia to develop this other thing. And I wasn't happy on Star Trek, and Columbia was an opportunity to get out from under. He says, well, but they're saying you're fired. What did you do over there? They're saying you never did anything worthwhile. So I walk in with my entire stack of stuff. And Gene was saying, To audience, he was pissed. He was saying, David never wrote anything useful. Well, some of the audition scenes I wrote got into the pilot script, that he shoved them into the pilot script. So my agent looks at this huge stack of stuff, says, we're going to the Guild. They take it to the Guild. The Guild looks at it and says, you did producer-level work. You're entitled to that payment. And the Guild goes to the studio and says, we would like you to pay David Gerrold for this. Oh, and by the way, we have evidence here that this fellow Leonard Maizlish has been rewriting scripts. He's not a member of the Writers Guild. You're in violation of the Guild rules. And Leonard Maizlish was banned from the lot immediately. The security guards packed up his stuff, frog marched him off the lot. I know this because I got thank you calls from it. I didn't do it. The Guild did it. And I've never heard anybody say a nice word about Leonard Maizlish. He managed to alienate. He bragged that he liked doing evil to people. He liked hurting people.
Well, I mean, it sounds like that's the key thing that wrecked a lot of relationships that Gene had with people on the show.
Gene was in tears one day. All my friends have left me. I don't understand why. And he did not realize that Leonard Maizlish had been like Iago, had gone behind, had been Gene's bad guy. Well, yeah, you want your lawyer there to do the unpleasant work for you, but Leonard Maizlish had gone way beyond what was acceptable even in Hollywood, which is to say a lot. I mean, people expect there's a certain amount of chicanery in the business because it's a business based on glamour, power, money, and illusion. But there's a gentleman's agreement that once you make a deal, you keep your word. There was a thing that happened one day where they had a meeting. They called in all the producers. And Gene said, we're over budget. You're all going to have to take a pay cut. And the producers got up and left. And like 5 minutes later, the phones were ringing all over legal from agents calling saying, you signed a contract. You're not cutting my... That was the end of that conversation. But that was Gene's lawyer trying to, And Gene was making an awful lot of money. He didn't have to do that. And the show could have been managed. It didn't need 6 producers. The original Star Trek, we had Gene L. Kuhn, we had Dorothy Fontana. You had your exec, you had your line producer, your showrunner, you had your line producer on the Bob Justman on the soundstage making that work, and you had your story editor. That's all you really need for a great show. And then you let your freelancers bring in ideas that you would never think of in a million years. That's how Tribbles got sold. The way Star Trek was run with all staff writers, the opportunity to do things out of the ordinary, to stretch the show, disappears. And this is true of all TV shows. They're all staff written these days. So the idea that, hey, here's this wild idea that this freelancer brought in doesn't happen anymore.
When did you decide that you'd had enough? I mean, what kind of finally pushed you?
It was Blood and Fire, my script.
Yeah.
And here's Gene had promised the fans. I was there. We were both invited to a Star Trek convention in Boston in November. The invitation had gone out before they knew there was going to be a new Star Trek. But we keep our word. We go to this convention. Of course, 3,000 people show up because they expect Gene to talk about the new Star Trek. And he says, we haven't even gotten into our offices yet. We can't even talk about what we're going to do because we don't even have an office where we can plan it yet. But he's being very gracious to the fans. And one of the fans asks, will there be gay characters? This is 1986, November of 86. And because you've had black and Asian and so on. And isn't it time we saw a gay character? And Gene, to his credit, said, you're right. It's time we saw a gay crew member. And I'm making notes, and I thought, yeah, right. Because I know how American television works. But, all right, let's see what happens. And about a month later, we're in a meeting, and we're actually talking about characters, and Gene says, we're probably going to have to put a gay crew member aboard. And Bob Justman says, what, Lieutenant Tutti Frutti? And Gene bawled him out. He says, no, stop that. And... he says, no, it's time. So I'm thinking, I want to do this script about the fear of AIDS. It isn't even about AIDS. It's about the fear of AIDS. So here's this ship that's been infected with a disease that's so awful we're supposed to blow it up rather than run the risk of infection. There's no way to rescue. But we don't discover this until after our away team is over there, so we're going to break the rules and attempt a rescue because, as it happens, that ship, they might have the cure. And along the way, as we're bringing people back, we run out of artificial blood. And we need blood donors. And the speech is, we need blood donors, and bam, 500 people are lined up to donate blood. And to me, that was one of the most noble things I had ever tried to put into a script. Now remember, this is 1986. We would do it differently today. I mean, we have 30 years, 40 years of perspective, and everybody has 20/20 hindsight, and I've seen fans writing their little essays about, I read it and blah, 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 and of course they're writing it with 30 years of hindsight, with 30 years of Next Generation and Voyager and Deep Space Nine, whatever, to compare it to. But at the time, we didn't know what the new Star Trek was going to be, and I was trying. This is what I think would work. No, we didn't have any scripts yet to polish, and all we have of Blood and Fire is a first draft. So I turn it in and go off on a cruise. At the cruise, I get a telegram from Gene. Everybody loves your script. Have a great time. Very generous of him. I get back from the Star Trek cruise, and there's this message. I get back, I guess, Sunday night, Monday, whatever, and there's this message. Oh, by the way, on the plane back, and I'm sitting next to Majel, and Majel says, "Is Gene all right?" Everybody, what am I going to say to his wife? No, we think something's going weird. I just, maybe I should have said, no, there's weird stuff, but, because I like Majel, but what should I say? Should I tell stories out of school? But I got it. She was genuinely concerned because she was seeing things at home. Anyway, but I get back. There's this message on my machine from Dorothy. Don't say anything. Don't talk to anyone until you talk to me. Turns out there's been this uproar over Blood and Fire. And I look at I get into my office and I look at all the memos, and here's Bob Justman saying one thing and Morris Hurley saying another, but the killer memo, the one that really hurt, was Rick Berman, who had said we should do a script about AIDS, is now saying we're going to be on at 4 o'clock in the afternoon someplace. Mommies are going to write letters. So I write a memo that says, Gene made a promise. If we don't do it here, where are we going to do it? If we don't do it now, when are we going to do it? Now, by the way, all I had in the script was, there's these two guys, and Riker says to one, how long have you two been together? And the other one says, since the academy. And that's it. That's the only part where nothing more than that. And then, of course, later on, the one who survives has gone a little crazy, and he wants to, and we have this confrontation on the bridge where we find out what has really been going on. I thought it was a good script because it got to what Star Trek had to be. There was an issue, there was a personal dilemma, and there was the scientific thing, and there was the Starfleet dilemma. There was the political dilemma. So there were all the different things. And I thought it had done, for a first draft, and I hadn't even set out to put gay characters in. It just happened in the writing that was what it needed. It wasn't even in the outline. It just happened in the script. Here's all this uproar. And Herb Wright sticks his head in my office. I don't even get called into a meeting about the script, which is rude. Herb Wright says, that was a great memo, the one I wrote. If not now, when? If not here, where? Great memo. You still have to take the gay characters out. Okay. So I replaced one of them with Tasha Yar, which is good because it took something else for Denise to do. And Denise is a wonderfully talented woman, and I've worked with her. I love her. I can't say enough nice things about her. She shows up on time. She knows her dialogue. She delivers it in one take. If you have to do a second take, it's for insurance or because somebody else screwed up. But you never have... Denise delivers. so I gave it to Denise because we hadn't done enough with Tasha Yar. And then it goes back and forth, and then Herb Wright is going to do a rewrite. And then I already know I'm going to leave the show, and I go into Gene's office one day and I say, "Look, Herb's got 7 things on his plate. Let me do the rewrite. I'm not going to charge you for it. Let me just do it for you. Make sure you have a good script." Gene says, "Wonderful." If Herb says, "Okay," then go ahead. So the elevator was very slow. So I run up 4 flights of stairs. I can't do that anymore, but I could do it then. And as I walk into Herb Wright's office, he's on the phone. And he says, "Okay, yes. All right, thank you, Gene," and hangs up. And he looks at me and says, "I won't lie for anybody. That was Gene. He told me to say no." I said, "Okay."
Wow.
Because I had already talked to Herb, and I had said, "Herb, I'll offer to do the rewrite." And Herb had said, "Yeah, it's fine with me if it's okay with Gene." So I go downstairs, tell Gene, go back upstairs. So it was like, okay. And that was the final straw. It's like, if I cannot trust Gene Roddenberry to tell me the truth. Yeah. And it hurt, because I thought after 20 years, and I was Gene, I stayed in touch with Gene when nobody else was calling him. When he was off in Siberia, because the studio had exiled him, when everybody else assumed he was a has-been, is that, well, they took Gene off Star Trek, he's done. When everybody else assumed that Gene was just this relic that the studio was being polite to, I stayed in touch with him because I liked him. And it hurt to be lied to.
Yeah. It
hurt. Gene would call me, teach me how to use my new computer. I'd go over. It's like, and I always, if Gene, because I felt not only that I owed it to him because Star Trek had given me this great start, God knows where I'd been without that great, launch, but I actually admired Gene for being this unconditional visionary, that he would never give up his idea that we could be better. Now, maybe he was just given the speech, but you know what? He gave that speech better than anybody I knew, except perhaps Harvey Milk. And I loved him for that. I still love that part of him, that as an executive producer, as a person who managed people, his competency wasn't up to his reach exceeded his grasp. And which was I think the biggest disappointment any of us had with Gene is that he could inspire us, but he couldn't quite deliver on the promises of managing us as a team, because we were on the team, ready to be there, whatever the team needed, but he wouldn't let us. Or maybe it was Leonard Maislish, but we weren't allowed to be the team. And if you look at what happened afterward, the team was never felt like a team. And when Rick Berman was in charge, writers weren't even allowed to visit the set and meet the actors. And I will tell you, that has to be the stupidest decision. One of the reasons why Tribbles turned out so well is I was on the set listening to the actors' speech patterns, watching how they interacted as characters, even getting to know them as people and understanding what they were great at to play to that. And being able to have that relationship with the actors and to be able to walk the set and to pick up a prop and to even have the director say, Mark Daniels would say something to me or this or that. I love Mark Daniels. That's your on-the-job training on how to do the series, on to have a relationship with the show that makes you understand that what you are doing creates jobs for 150 other people. And that if you make this decision red or blue, you are determining somebody else's job. And you want to get their input back. If Matt Jeffrey said to me one day, he says, "We can't shoot Tribbles." I said, "What do you mean we can't shoot? It's too expensive. You have this set and that set. I can't afford to give you both sets. You know how much a foot of corridor costs?" I says, "What if I combine both of those into one set, and I can combine the two different actors into..." So we had a trading post in the bar, became one set, the two different actors became one actor, and suddenly the script got better. That would not have happened except that Matt Jeffries told me. See, so not having access to the people who actually roll up their sleeves and do the physical labor is crippling your writers. Your writers are research machines. And that's what, when I heard that particular story, I thought, well, gee, why not shoot yourself in the other foot, too? If you're not going to let writers visit the soundstage, why not shoot yourself in the head? So, anyway, but the day that Gene lied to me, I went out to lunch with Dorothy and Herb, the three of us, and I said, what should I do? He said, you can't stay. I said, all right, I'm gone.
Talk me through your last day on the production.
Oh, yeah. There's a story I love to share. We we had the sets, and we had the beautiful bridge set. It looked like the lobby of the Ramada Inn, but it's a beautiful set. And it wasn't what I would have designed, because it was a little too pleasant, because it has to say this is a working environment. But man, it's still a gorgeous set. And they had this big view screen. And they had hung this giant sheet of black paper. And this prop man had poked little holes in it and had lights behind it for the stars. And they pointed a camera at it to see how it would photograph, because you do these tests. And one of the prop men was off, you couldn't see him, rippling the corner so that all the stars would twinkle. And now I missed watching dailies on the big screen. But what we were getting now is a huge TV screen, like a 34-inch TV screen, set up in the trailer, and you could go in and pop the VCR in and watch. And I was like, all right, whatever. Which to me is not the way you watch dailies. Dailies should be watched by everybody together. But anyway, so we have these first dailies of what this is going to look like. And there's about 30 people in the trailer. Producers, grips, costume, everybody. Not Gene, maybe Rick Berman, I don't remember. And this was like one of the, and I go in and I'm sitting way at the back, and everybody say, boy, those stars twinkle good. Yeah, those stars twinkle good. Over here in this corner. I like the twinkling. This good twinkle. I said, yeah, that works. And everybody has to speak up at some point or other. And after a while, there's this silence, and we're watching Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, right? No sound. And finally, I say, you do realize, of course, in the vacuum of space, the stars don't twinkle. And now there's absolute silence in the room. And finally, somebody says, he's right. Those stars shouldn't be twinkling. Somebody else says, yeah, David's right. Those stars should not be twinkling. I said, yeah, those stars should not be twinkling. Yeah, I agree with David. Those stars. And it goes around the room, and I keep hearing, yeah, David's right. And I realize this is what's going to be missing from Star Trek, is that I'm one of the few people who actually has a scientific background, who actually has the science fiction background. And that while everybody else is great at doing what their jobs are, the fact is that if somebody had said, we got to have the stars twinkling, and if I had been functioning as a showrunner early on, I'd say, why do we have to have the stars twinkle? They don't twinkle in space. And we wouldn't have had to sit through 20 minutes of, gosh, those stars twinkle good. So that was a clue to me that there was a large piece of the puzzle missing. I recognize television is television. And there are certain compromises you make. You compress time. You cheat. You have to sometimes go to science fiction double talk. Because you're in the business of telling a story. And the audience will go along with it. If you're grounded in believability, they'll let you stretch it a little bit. It's television. But there's this gray area, there's this boundary area that if you go past it, the audience goes, well, this isn't science fiction anymore. They're just jerking us off. So, and unfortunately, I think that was part of the resignation that the fans felt. The fans wanted the great new Star Trek that was promised. What they got was a lot of props and costumes and special effects, but where they were disappointed was in the quality of the writing and the storytelling. And if you go back and you look at the reviews and you look at what was on well, most of it's been lost, but if you could remember what was on CompuServe and all the bulletin boards and all of the fanzines from the first 2 years of Star Trek Next Generation, what the overlying theme is disappointment. And I didn't say anything. For years, Gene was, the official line was, David Gerrold is this disgruntled, bitter ex-employee. And I wasn't saying anything. People would come to me and say, what's going on over there? I said, oh, I don't know. But the official line was, I was the one spreading all these terrible rumors. And finally, it got to, David Gerrold is leaking all these rumors onto CompuServe. And finally, the people running the CompuServe forum had to write a note. David isn't telling us anything. David is refusing to tell us anything. David's only comment is no comment. Your soundstage and your offices leak like a steel sieve. It is not coming from David. It's coming from bump and bump and bump. They didn't name names, but we knew who was leaking. It wasn't me. But I was taking the blame for a few years, and it hurt. There were Star Trek conventions who withdrew their invitations to me because I was the official enemy. I said, fine, I don't care, And I stopped going to conventions for a few years, and then all of a sudden people say, oh my gosh, you write science fiction too? No, I write science fiction first. I got appointed this generation's Harlan Ellison. Well, no, I'm not. I'm David Gerrold. I have my own, curmudgeonliness. I don't have to borrow Harlan. By the way, I'm seeing Harlan later tonight. Harlan is Harlan's my big brother. And I love him like, he's one of the guys who, if he talks the talk, you can count on him to walk the walk. And so a lot of what Harlan's complaints about Star Trek were, the City on the Edge of Forever script he wrote couldn't have been shot as he wrote it. But his complaints were about the Cavalier treatment. So it was not just Next Gen. It wasn't just Leonard Maizlish. There was some stuff going on the original series. I wasn't behind the scenes there, so anything I've heard is hearsay evidence. Yeah. I'm sorry. We should have been much more happy about it. I actually have to say, there were times, and I really have to say this, there were times, especially in the very early days, when we did not know, and when it was still an unformed vision, our enthusiasm, we were having so much fun. It was an incredible amount of fun. And I wish that the show that eventually got produced had lived up to the vision that had been promised in the early days. Because it was fun to be part of that at the beginning.
I want to ask you a question about that vision. There's this thing that we have heard when we started going into Next Gen. Gene Roddenberry didn't want any fighting in Starfleet. That was fine for other things, but we've sort of gotten to the top of the hill at this point, as far as, I don't know, humanity or the Federation or whatever you want to say. This thing that we've always been...
That was more Leonard Maizlish than Gene. I think Gene still understood that real drama comes from the conflict between two people, and that people have different perspectives, and people are going to argue about different solutions. But Leonard Maizlish was the one walking around saying, our people can't argue with each other. Oh, all right. Well, that was exciting. But anyway, is there more to your question? I apologize for interrupting.
No, I think that's it. Yeah.
I will do this. Gene gave great inspirational speeches, and if that all he did, it was, The thing is, he gave us Star Trek. There's more impact on our culture than anything else in the history of media. That Star Trek, in its own way, Star Trek has been bigger than the Beatles. That mitigates a lot. It really does. To be able to create something so powerful, it mitigates a lot. Those of us who were lucky enough to be part of that adventure, it has changed our lives. It's changed my life. It made me a better person to be part of Star Trek. Because here's this vision of what humanity could be. We get along. There's no more discrimination or prejudice or stupidity. It's like, it's a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out. It's like, I'm in favor of that. Where I get frustrated is that people came aboard the show who weren't there to be part of that vision. They were there, how much money can I make? They were there as, how much fame can I get? How much, there were people there for the wrong reasons and who didn't share Gene's vision. And if we could have been aligned on the vision, and if we could have had the team like we had with Gene L. Kuhn, if we could have had that team, we would have had the Star Trek that, because back in the 60s when we had Star Trek, we went to the moon. If we could have had that Star Trek again, we'd have been on Mars by now, because that was the inspiration Star Trek represented to the world.
I just got one last thing that I want to talk about real quick. When Blood and Fire then was reformatted and produced independently.
Yeah, that was funny.
So, yeah.
I kept getting these calls from Jim Scully, and I kept hanging up on him. And Dorothy Fontana said, no, talk to him. Because I just did a script with Walter Koenig, and it turned out very well. And so, all right. So I talked to Cawley, and he says, I want you to do a script for us. I said, I don't want to write another Star Trek script. I got books to write. He says, no, can I do Blood and Fire? No, I said to him, do you want Blood? I'll give you Blood and Fire. He says, yeah, well, that's the one I want. And he said, do you want to rewrite it for Kirk and Spock? I said, I don't want to go near it. Have your guy rewrite it. And Carlos Pedraza took it and turned it into Kirk and Spock and kept a lot of the relationships worked much better with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And Cawley sends me the script. I read it. All right, fine, go shoot it. And he says, don't you want to do a rewrite on it? I said, no. And he says, really? I said, all right, well, there is one line. We would never say that in classic Star Trek. It's just wrong. I don't remember what the line was. It just leapt off the page. And I said, all right, I'll fix well, so I rolled it into the machine, right? And next thing I know, I've done a complete page one rewrite because Carlos has set up all these wonderful things that he hasn't used. So he's got a battle with the Romulans at the beginning. Well, okay, why do you want to have a battle? Why are we at war? Because I'm going to change it to the Klingons, and then I'm going to bring the Klingons back at the end because I can do this punchline of, I'll give you a chance to make peace. So that it's not about going to war, it's about making peace. Because that's what Star Trek's about. And then I look at, and James says, look, we want to keep the gay characters. I said, good, because otherwise I wouldn't let you do it. Because I was, it's like Star Trek had the opportunity to be the first show to put a gay character in 1987, and now Star Trek still hasn't done it, and everybody else has. And so Star Trek, and from what I hear from people who are connected to the show, it's never going to happen because of the attitudes of certain people. So, all right. So you're going to keep the gay characters? And he says, yeah, but I want one of them to be Kirk's nephew. And I think about that. I said, all right, fine. And then I get into it, and we realize, we have to go farther. This is 2007. It's 20 years later. We have to. And I said, well, he wants to marry his boyfriend. He wants to marry his partner. And he has to go to Captain Kirk and say, will you marry us? I said, that's the scene. So, all right. So it gave us this great scene where Peter Kirk goes to Captain Kirk and says, well, you haven't put me on the mission team. That means you're being protective of me. And I'm going to have to ask for a transfer. And so will my husband. Kirk goes, husband? Yes, if you'll marry us. And marry you? And then he said, okay, I'll put you on the mission team, go get your gear. And he turns to Spock and says, am I the only one who didn't know? And Spock says, I think Mr. Scott was too busy to notice, which is it's to play the scene. And we went, and by now it has been decided that I'm going to direct it because I'm the only one who knows this well enough to. And so I go in and tell James Cawley and Bobby Quinn Rice, who's just marvelous to work with, both of them. And I say, this is the only place where I want you to do the Shatner imitation. And so the two of them go off and practice doing the dialogue as they believe Shatner would do it, because Bobby Quinn Rice then has this wonderful scene where the boyfriend, Lieutenant Freeman, says, well, what did Captain Kirk say? And he says, and so Bobby Quinn Rice does the parody, says, husband? Mary, with the hand gestures like Shatner would. So the two of them were off at the end of the corridor with this beautiful set, rehearsing how to do the dialogue as Shatner would. And I'm falling down laughing. I wish we had gotten that on the blooper reel. So you get the scene where Peter Kirk says it tells Captain Kirk, and then you get a scene later on where he tells Lieutenant Freeman what the conversation went with Captain Kirk. But the amazing thing that happened as we developed this story is that it is not about the relationship between Peter Kirk and Lieutenant and Alex. It is about the relationship between Peter Kirk and Captain Kirk, because it all comes down to the fact that Peter Kirk wants to stop being Captain Kirk's nephew and be Ensign Kirk on the Starship Enterprise. And which, to me, of all the things we did in that episode, we had a lot of different plot lines going, a lot of stuff, and we had only 10 days to shoot it, but we managed to get every shot we needed. It all fit together because it all comes down to this one scene at the end where Freeman has been killed by this infection, and Peter Kirk and Captain Kirk are watching the other ship burn up. And Captain Kirk says, in the old days, you would put the warrior on his boat and light it on fire, and you couldn't ask for a better send-off. And they look at the ship burn up and they say, Godspeed. Mikhail Hodel, named after Mike Hodel, an old friend. Godspeed, Alex Freeman. Godspeed. And it's one of the most moving funeral scenes. It's one of the most moving scenes I've ever written because it's about love and loss and redemption. And to me, it was like, this is the kind of Star Trek I always wanted to write, where we feel empowered and inspired. And it you know, it's on YouTube, Blood and Fire, and it's a 2-hour. We did it as a 2-parter, and it has a perfect Star Trek ending because it wasn't a disease that infected people. It was a disease of a larger organism called a sparkle dancer, which we get to see at the end. And the thing that I'm so proud of is not just that we got to do a great job, but there's this incredible cast and crew, all fans, all volunteering their time and energy, rebuilt the original sets down to the millimeter. Costumes, props, special effects, and their passion and enthusiasm and commitment. And James Cawley had that spirit and vision and enthusiasm. Everybody shows up to work their asses off. And it's the kind of team you want to have on a sound stage. It's the kind of production team you want to have. And the whole thing, that commitment, enthusiasm, passion, and morale, that was great. That was the way Star Trek should be produced. Now I'll tell you one other story.
Do it.
A lot shorter. We've redressed the bridge of the Enterprise to be the destroyed bridge of the Copernicus, and we've got about 30 people working, getting ready for the shot, and I'm explaining to the actors, now the bloodworms do this and this and this. And this little voice from the back, this little girl goes, "Excuse me, Mr. Gerrold, but that's not canon." And there's this silence. And I remember the silence. And everybody's turning to me. And I say, I made up the bloodworms. They'll do any damn thing I tell them to do. But, I mean, really, the affection that fans have for Star Trek, nobody matches that. Nowhere. Because it's not just we're fans of a TV show. It's we're fans of a vision. And it is Gene's vision, and I give him credit for that.
David, I wish we could do this all day.
Yeah,
but
we could.
We gotta stop at some point. You have a life to lead.
I have to go hang out with Harlan Ellison. What a horrible day I'm having. First I have to talk about Star Trek, and then I have to go hang out with Harlan Ellison. Oh my gosh.
Ken, we good?
How is he doing?
Harlan is doing great. I saw him last week. Yeah, he's a little frail. He'll be frail at my funeral, too. But his spirit is unbreakable, which is I hope when I reach that age, which will be in 10 years, that I'm as unbreakable.
From the Roddenberry archive, let's take a closer look at a discovered document.
So we've got a new feature on the Mission Log Supplemental, a little bit different. You know that we've done discovered documents throughout the regular Mission Log show, but something keeps happening that we keep getting more documents. We keep discovering more and more documents, and we're trying to figure out what to do with them all, because sometimes they're relevant to an episode, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're just interesting to serve as background for the production of Star Trek. So this kicks off what I hope will be a long-running segment on the Mission Log Supplementals. We get to welcome a friend of mine, and I'm sure somebody that pretty much everybody in our audience knows by name, Larry Nemechek, or should I call you Dr. Trek?
Oh, I thought it was going to be like Edward Snowden or something.
Calling in from his bunker in Russia. We have
more documents.
Right.
No.
Right.
No. Thank you, John. This is going to be a lot of fun. Thank you for having me on, and hopefully we'll enjoy deep diving these documents.
Yeah. Well, this is something that Rod kind of wanted us to do, because it's weird. It's like every month or so a truckload shows up of new documents, and somebody's got to go through them and figure them out, and we thought, better that we just take them as they come, and if there's something interesting, talk about it and put it on the website. So that's what we're doing. And I wanted to kick things off with one that I thought was really interesting. So today's memo is, I feel like it needs a little bit of a background, a little bit of an introduction from me, because I haven't done this very often. But every now and then we have a memo that I feel like I really want to publish, but we also need to redact some of the information in there. And the reason is this. And
by redact, we mean good old Nixon,
Yep.
We mean CIA documents with the black marks through the lines.
Right. And even under pain of torture, I will not reveal my sources or the information contained therein. But the deal is this. You and I definitely, and I think the vast majority of the people listening to this show, we are fans and we're respectful of the show and we're respectful of the people in the show. And it doesn't make sense to present information that could just come across as embarrassing to somebody who worked there. Now, all that said, the context of what we're talking about, I think, is very interesting, and that's why it needs to be shared. So today what we have is...
Absolutely.
Yeah. So today what we have is a memo from Bob Justman to Gene Roddenberry, written in July of 1987. So this would have been early in the filming of Season 2, correct?
No,
Season 1.
I was just checking. This is Encounter at Farpoint, filmed from May 29th to June 25th.
Okay.
So this is...
You're within the first few episodes.
Right. The last day, Naked Now was the second episode, and it finished filming on July 11th. So this was as the second episode was wrapping up.
Oh, wow. Okay. So
we're early bird, yes.
Very early. And what we have is Bob Justman sending a memo to Gene saying, hey, I was on set the other day, and one of the actors... and I'm using that in the gender-neutral version. One of the actors came up to me and said, I don't like a line that I am being told to say here. And I think that I should change it, and I think it would be better if I changed it.
Right.
And when Bob said, no, I don't think so. I think you should just say the line as it is, this person then sort of turned it around and said, okay, well, look, I'm just going to have to call Gene. and what I love here, this is so great. Bob, who I have said many times before, and I know that you agree with me, Bob Justman could turn a phrase. The man could write a memo. And it would be funny and so on the nose. And he starts out the third paragraph. He says, now I know I'm just another stupid producer. But even a stupid producer knows when he's being threatened. So rather than create an unnecessary confrontation, I agreed to the line change. However, and we'll just sort of go on from there. And basically what it comes down to is he's asking Gene for a change in policy that says that line changes will not be made unless they are approved by either Bob or Rick. So
right, or Gene.
Or Gene. And he's saying to Gene, can you please look, I want to make this the least uncomfortable as I can. So if you can send out a memo to that effect to everybody, not just singling out this person, but if you send it out to everybody, then they will know that either you or I or Rick Berman will have the authority to approve or disapprove a line change. I love this.
Right. Well, with that, this is your workplace harassment, and this is where it's not so much about a TV show as it is. This is how a functioning body has to work.
Yeah.
And notice that he also says not just the cast. He says the assistant directors and the script supervisor.
Right.
Good old Cosmo for years and years and years. So the guy with the script book who's prompting them, and the ADs and the cast. So it's like let's let everybody know about this.
Right.
So nobody's getting the shine on anybody else trying to pull a fast one.
It's the most politic way to do this, and still be able to put your foot down. And that comes from a guy who's been in the business for a long time and has probably dealt with an actor or two or an ego or two that maybe just felt a little out of line.
Bob Justman was, I will go say this over and over and over again, on the original series, and then you go back, and I got this into the companion because he shared with me a sheaf of his memos when I was writing the companion. It was one of the it saved my butt at the early part of writing that on such a short deadline. But he was uniquely, it's like the inverse, as much creativity he contributed and as much oil and lubrication to all the gears of the show around him on both the acting side and the production side, on prep, stage, and post. He should have had a much higher title than he did on the original series, and he got that his year on Next Generation, which was kind of like to prove the world wrong that this was going to make it, but he was wearing himself out again, as an older man. So for the amount of guff that he was taking and contributing, and to get as little credit over the years, undercredited, that's been one of my soapboxes, to get this man thing. Plus, yes, he wrote hell of an, his memos are incredibly funny. See, line 12, scene 15 on page 9 made me want to go home and hurt my wife.
Yes,
that's one of the famous ones. But y'all know this one. But again, he's a class act also.
Yeah.
And he's come up with this. And I love how he says, you have to back us up on this, otherwise we'll end up with the inmates running the asylum.
Right. And running a TV show from week to week feels like an asylum, I'm sure. You know? The thing that I also like here is it shows you a little bit about that structure behind the scenes. So here's Gene sitting in the office and not really being down on set that much, but kind of being the mastermind behind all of this. And then here's Bob Justman and Rick Berman really seemingly like the day-to-day producers, the guys who are on the set, making sure that it all happens, making sure that all the people are in place and all the things are happening to make sure that the show works at the end of the day. But it also shows you that impression that people have that, like, well, okay, Rick and Bob may be here running things, but we know whose ear we can kind of bend. We know that when Mom says no, we'll go to Dad. When Dad says no, we'll go to Grandma. It's right. This playing against each other. But then it just took their cooperation to kind of settle that.
And let's just remember, this is the baby days.
Yeah.
The show has only been out a year. It was, as we know from watching the episodes, it was very much not a runaway hit. They had their contracts, but there was still a lot of growing and settling and evolving, and the production was fairly settled. The writing was anything but.
Right.
And this is early. This is the second episode. And Rick, we were sitting here tossing off Bob and Rick. But yeah. Rick, Eddie Milkus had started through the pre-production time, and just before the pilot started to film was when he backed off and said, okay, I'm really retiring. This is wearing me out. And Gene reached out, had met Rick as the studio guy who was overseeing the show, and said, hey, come aboard the show. And he did. So it's not like Rick was the Rick Berman we think of today.
Right.
You know, the overseer of all things Trek for almost 20 years.
Right.
From the throne there in the Cooper building. So he's still a junior boy here, too. And Bob is very much the senior producer on the show.
Yeah.
So
yeah, very cool. I love seeing anything from Bob Justman, and I love that little peek. I love that little peek into the backstage to see maybe what the egos were like at play, and how to run a successful show even when you feel like it's getting away from you.
And you know, in an era, this is a little bit like the Burns documentaries where they worry about, you know, you can do a Civil War documentary with letters and all that dramatic reading, but what the hell are we going to do 100 years from now when everything was email and digital and tweets and Facebook posts? And you read a Bob Justman memo and you remember that in the 60s especially, but even early Next Generation, and they did it all up to the time I came over and then the later series, but still, it's like the art of the well-written memo.
Right.
It's like, it almost like, I don't want to say it almost makes me painful, but to see something written out in full sentences and paragraphs,
Right.
like they're like Bob's got a PhD in philosophy or something, but no, it's just people wrote in full sentences and they wrote in full paragraphs. And of course they would have dictaphones and they would transcribe things for their assistants to type out. But
Sure.
But just the fact that this is not a bleep and a bloop, you know, on a scratch on the side of a page. It's a fully written memo. That's a thing to behold, and it almost makes me cry that we've come so far now that, you know, because this was one of 40 billion one of 47 billion things.
Right. Oh, good.
He had to do this day. Like the last thing he wanted to do was referee something, but he's right. He says let's nip this in the bud here before it gets crazy.
Right. Well, Larry, thank you so much again for joining us today. And remember, friends, that you can find Larry, a.k.a. Dr. Trek, at his website, LarryNemechek.com, and also at TreklandBlog.com. And you can also follow him at Larry Nemechek on Twitter. And please remember to like Larry Nemechek's Trekland on Facebook. You will also find the Trekland Trunk Facebook page where you can find all kinds of cool stuff from Larry's archives for collectors. And don't forget to support his documentary film, The Con of Wrath, at theconofwrath.com. So after we recorded the show, and we recorded this a few weeks ago, but we recently learned that Grace Lee Whitney passed away. And Ken, it's been a little bit of a rough year for friends in the Star Trek family. So this was another one that was sad and unexpected, that Grace Lee Whitney, who of course played Yeoman Rand in season 1 of the original series, is no longer with us. I always remember seeing her at conventions, just sort of, you could hear her from down the aisle, you know, because there was always activity at her table, and she was very sort of warm and gregarious and would just talk to anybody about anything. She was a lot of fun.
One of our, I don't know if I should mention him by name or not, but one of our most ardent listeners, I would say, actually had his head taken off by Grace Lee Whitney at the last convention in Las Vegas.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Yes, he did. And what's really cool is they ended up talking very friendly. They ended up having a decent time in their conversation, but no shrinking violet.
No,
I would say
she had what you could describe as a very colorful life.
Yeah.
And certainly Star Trek was a sort of a small chapter within that. And it's interesting because within Star Trek, it was always one of those what could have been storylines, you know, because she was gone kind of prematurely. But it was cool that she popped back in from time to time, like in the motion picture and then in subsequent movies. So I thought that was really neat. But I will certainly remember her presence at conventions. And to that listener, you know who you are. But yeah, sad to hear that. And we thought we would be remiss if we didn't mention that in today's show.
Indeed. If you have a special memory, by the way, because we're reaching out to one person, but, you know, as you mentioned, it's been sort of a rough year for some of the Star Trek community. And people want to share, you know, stories that they have, or just, you know, anything else that they would like to share with us. We do, of course, have contact information, ways to get in touch with us, and we'd love to share that with you. Mission Log Pod is the way to get in touch with us on Facebook, Skype, and Twitter. That again is Mission Log Pod. You can call us 323-522-5641. That number again, 323-522-5641. You can email us, missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our show website, including discovered documents, is at missionlogpodcast.com. And remember, we may use your comments on an upcoming episode of Mission Log.